Welcome to Innovators, a series where we sit down with thought leaders in the healthcare technology space to talk about news and trends impacting the industry today. My name is Justine Giancola. I'm on the corporate communications team at Inovalon, and joining me today is Jen Lampa, the AVP of Product on our Data Insights team at Inovalon. Today, we're going to talk about real-world data and the impact that it has on clinical research. Thanks for being here today, Jen.
Thank you for having me, Justine. Happy to be here.
So, for starters, let's kind of start high level. Tell us, what is real-world data and what is the general role that it plays in healthcare?
So there are many definitions for real-world data. The one that we'll go with for today is real-world data are any healthcare data that are collected outside of a structured, traditional, usually randomized, controlled clinical trial. So that's, a variety of different data sources. And the ones that we'll be focused on today are data that are collected for some primary purpose, but that we use in a secondary use case. A good example is if I walk into the doctor, right, for my annual checkup. My PCP is going to be taking notes in an electronic medical record system, and that is clinical real-world data. When I leave that doctor's office, my PCP's administration will bill insurance for that visit, and that is administrative real-world data. All of that real-world data exists on every patient in the healthcare ecosystem, and there's so many cool things we can do with it.
So that kind of leads me to my next question of how this impacts research. So how is data empowering healthcare research, and how is it supporting those research priorities?
Real-world data can help research from before a new and experimental treatment even touches its first human patient. It can be used to understand underlying patient populations, what their current health status is and health outcomes, their demographics and comorbidities. It can then be used to design better clinical trials, ones that are more representative, ones that have higher chances of completing, right? Knowing the statistics that we know on trial completion and delayed trials, significant resources and costs go into operationalizing clinical studies. So having the intelligence up front to know how to design a study that is going to succeed and get valuable information out on patients is extremely important. Clinical trial real-world data can even be distilled into evidence as part of a clinical study. And finally, my most favorite use case for real-world data is it can be used to see all patients, right? Clinical trials offer a very narrow window into a patient population, usually very heavily guarded by inclusion and exclusion criteria. And real-world data is generated on all patients that are interacting with healthcare systems. So you really get a much more diverse picture of healthcare outcomes.
And I love that you mentioned outcomes because, as you know, at Inovalon, that is so big for us, and why we do what we do is to ultimately impact. There's a person at the end of everything here. So love to hear you say that. And looking at kind of the advancements in healthcare, there has been quite a few in recent years. So would love to know, how has real-world data evolved most recently, and what does that innovation look like going forward?
Yeah. Real-world data are always evolving, right? There are three main ways that I'll touch on. The first is just the volume of it, right? The volume of real-world data in the U.S. is growing exponentially across all of these different sources as more patients receive care and there are more patients put into increasingly digitalized systems. Also, the variety of real-world data. We talked about clinical real-world data and we talked about administrative real-world data, but there's genomics, labs, biosensor and wearable data, patient-reported outcomes that really get at the heart of what matters to a patient, right? How a patient is feeling and doing and their sort of true health status in a way that is meaningful to them. Those two points, and then the use cases that you can realize with real-world data and the expanding new applications that you have with it. I'm particularly excited about the ones in a regulatory grade sense, right? So taking something that might be an off-label indication today, but that you're seeing a trend for physicians using a given medication in a new disease population as a novel treatment, which is something that physicians have the prerogative to do. Taking that and turning it into evidence to support an indication expansion, to get that patient population access to now a treatment that will benefit them. there are so many new applications. And one of the things that I love about being here at Inovalon is that we have all of this data, and ultimately we're the stewards, right, of how that data makes it to those new use cases. So we have to be very focused on how to enable that, right? How do we take and package and productize that data in a way that allows these new use cases to come into existence? We could probably have a whole separate session just on the ways in which we do that.
Okay, well then we might have to schedule a part 2 here, because we'll definitely love to get on to the topic of productization. But, being aware of time today, just want to ask you one more question before we wrap up. There is so much that can be discovered through data research. And so I would love to know, what is one of the most interesting real-world data findings that you've come across recently?
So the team that I work with, we like to think of ourselves as explorers of this data, right? Getting in there and really understanding what's going on inside it, what insights we can distill from it. One of the insights that one of my colleagues, Katie Smith, distilled recently was related to the diversity of clinical trial participation at research sites. So we went and we looked at different sites of care, and we're able to flag which patients are associated with clinical research, ones receiving services in administrative claims data that are tied to a clinical study. And we compared the demographics of that population to the underlying disease population at that site. And what we found was, unsurprisingly, but also quite strikingly, there were disparities between the patients that were participating in clinical trials and the ones that weren't. We saw differences in age, we saw differences in sex, and we saw differences in race and ethnicity that pointed to perhaps underlying differences in social demographics of health. That type of an insight is really powerful, because you can take it and turn around and say, okay, what can I do for a given site to close these gaps in study participation so that all patients are able to be seen and able to be understood in the context of bringing new treatments to the clinic.
Jen, I think there is clearly so much great work has been done using the data that we have access to. Certainly sounds like we could have more of a conversation around this, so would love to reconnect with you and the team. But just want to say thank you so much for being here today, and for a great conversation.
Justine, it was my pleasure. Thanks again.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Be sure to join us again next time.